And then, suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic, scaly arms, and while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. When I came to out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of an American ship, which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon, perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnant of puny or exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as if of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. When I first read the short story Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft back when I was in college, I was immediately impressed with the author's grandiose language and his ability to cause feelings of angst and disturbance and terror even in a reader so remote from the world that the story depicts. On top of that, I also really appreciated the fact that when Lovecraft was building his mythology, when he was looking for references to sort of build his creatures off of that, he actually looked at historical religions to some extent, and decided to use those as anchor points for his own mythos. One of them, which manifests here in the story Dagon, is the Philistine fish god, Dagon, after whom the story is named. But the further I looked into this deity, it turns out that the story of Dagon is actually a lot more complicated and a lot more confusing than I had originally anticipated. That's what we're talking about today on this short entry of The Plague of Frogs. H.P. Lovecraft was an American author who wrote in the early 1900s and was very prolific over the course of his writing career, despite the fact that he never really enjoyed a whole lot of fame in his own day. What Lovecraft is remembered for, however, is his contribution to horror fiction, with the invention, or at least the popularization, of a subgenre of horror called cosmic horror. While it's difficult to describe, cosmic horror generally focuses on the ideas of these massive beings of cosmic proportions, compared to which humankind is so infinitesimally small and puny and useless that even the sight of these great abominations and terrors is enough to drive most ordinary people insane. The creatures of Lovecraft's mythos are famously modeled after sea creatures, the alienness of underwater life being used as a reflection of the alienness of the gargantuan monsters that inhabit Lovecraft's stories. One of the stories that Lovecraft wrote was the aforementioned Dagon, from which we cited from at the beginning of this video. The story of Dagon follows a sailor who had been captured during the Great War, World War I, but who had escaped captivity in a small boat and found himself adrift in the ocean. After being adrift for quite a long time, he wakes up one day to realize that his boat has beached on a sort of strange mire that's just spreading as far as he can see. Spotting a small hill on the horizon, he dismounts and heads towards the hill, hoping for some sort of rescue. Across the alien landscape he goes, and upon reaching the hill, he crests the hill to see a massive obelisk figure, which seems to be artificial. That's to say, it isn't a natural formation. As he gazes in terror at the obelisk and realizes that there's strange hieroglyphs and carvings mounting the whole exterior surface of it, all of a sudden he realizes that he's not the only person at this site. The mire itself bubbles, and with barely a sound or an indication that something has passed through it, a massive fish-like monster emerges from the mire and embraces the obelisk. This sight, understandably, drives the sailor mad, and he retreats. He seems to have found his way back to the ocean and wakes up in a San Francisco hospital, informing everybody of what happened, although nobody believes him, thinking him instead to be dehydrated and hallucinating. Towards the end of the story, the sailor mentions the fact that he consulted an ethnologist for information on fish-like creatures in ancient religions. And the answer that he received, or at least the closest thing to an answer that he received, was the figure of Dagon, the fish god of the Philistines. This is a figure that shows up a couple times in the Bible, especially in 1 Samuel and Judges, and the sailor receives this information as basically the only answer to what he was looking for from the ethnologist. The story caught my attention when I first read it because of the contents and quality of it. It's an amazing story, and it's very exciting. But it also caught my attention because it employed something that I was relatively familiar with. It involved biblical lore in some sense or another. But as I studied more into this topic, I realized that the figure of Dagon is actually a lot more complicated than it was previously assumed, and so we're going to dive into that a little bit further today. The god Dagon wasn't only known from the Bible and antiquity. Numerous inscriptions from various parts of the ancient world reveal the fact that Dagon was actually a very prolific deity, probably beginning in central Mesopotamia or eastern Syria and proliferating its cult to the rest of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, he was identified with the king of the gods Enlil, and in the Canaanite world, or at least in Phoenicia, he was identified with the father of Baal. So the figure of Dagon was a very widespread figure in antiquity, but there are several mysteries remaining about Dagon's identity and function. Before I go any further, I want to bring up the fact that the pronunciation Dagon is technically derivative of the original pronunciation of the deity's name. So the deity in most ancient texts was described as being called Dagon, with two A's, or Dagon, something of that nature. The reason he's called Dagon in Hebrew is because of something called the Canaanite shift. Long story short, essentially Hebrew and several other West Semitic languages underwent a shift such that some letter A's became letter O's. Dagon isn't the only word this shows up in, but I think it's worth noting that Dagon in Hebrew and Dagon in other Semitic languages are probably references to the same deity. The name Dagon shows up 3 times in the Old Testament, once in the book of Judges, once in the book of 1 Samuel, and once in the book of 1 Chronicles. He appears in all 3 cases as being the god of the Philistines, but the reason that's weird is because he doesn't seem to have been worshipped by the Canaanites. He seems to have had a presence in Phoenicia, slightly north of the land of Canaan, but we don't have any records of Canaanite worship of Dagon. To clarify on that a bit further, I recognize that Philistines and Canaanites are assumed by a lot of people to be the same culture, but they're technically distinct. Although the exact origins of the Philistines continues to be a topic of hot debate, it seems most likely that the Philistines were from the Greek world, specifically probably from either the Aegean Sea or from the island of Crete, and they left their homes during something called the Bronze Age collapse, around the time that Israel came to occupy the land as well, and spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean. These are likely, or at least the Philistines were part of, the Sea Peoples problem, which is a problem of mass migration that shows up in Hittite and Egyptian texts around that same time. So the Philistines and the Canaanites both lived in the promised land that Israel was promised, but they weren't culturally the same. Like I said, the Philistines were the descendants of Aegean or Cretan Greeks, whereas the Canaanites were a Northwest Semitic people. Now, the Philistines certainly seem to have slowly moved towards the cultures around them, sort of leaving off the culture they took with them and picking up cultural motifs of the cultures around them, but for a very long time they still remained a distinct culture, at least in the time of the Bible. So let's get back to the fishman of the hour himself. Dagon was a very prolific deity in the ancient world. He was worshipped far and wide, as early as the 3rd millennium BC. But the height of Dagon's popularity came with the Mari state. Mari was a city-state contemporary with the Old Babylonian period, so roughly 1800 BC. That's about 800 years prior to the monarchy in Israel. And Dagon's worship at Mari was the height of his popularity. He was worshipped elsewhere, and he was worshipped for the time after this time period, but this was really as popular as Dagon would probably ever get. Now, this isn't to say that the worship of Dagon originated at Mari. Dagon was already known in the Ebla text substantially earlier, as early as the 3rd millennium BC. But he really came into his own as a major deity in a major state during the Mari period. When the cult of Dagon made its way down to Mesopotamia, Dagon was identified with a local deity, Enlil. Enlil was the older brother of Enki in Mesopotamian texts and serves as the king of the gods figure in a lot of their materials. So that suggests to us that when the cult of Dagon was introduced to Mesopotamia, they recognized the same motifs and the same ideas in Dagon as they saw with their own local god Enlil, and assumed these were two different names for the same deity. So that covers the movement of the cult of Dagon east to Mesopotamia, but not west to Phoenicia. Inscriptions from the city of Ugarit suggest that Dagon was known as a deity there. He received offerings and sacrifices and had his own cult focused around him. But Dagon appears there as a secondary deity, not someone who'd been in the pantheon for a particularly long time. That being said, Dagon is remembered favorably by the Phoenicians as being the father of Baal. The fact that Dagon is mentioned as the father of Baal is a little bit confusing, because Baal is also mentioned as being the son of El in the Ugaritic literature. So, scholars have many different models of figuring out how this was supposed to work out. It seems that El and Dagon were co-identified in the same way that Enlil and Dagon were co-identified, but it seems that they maintained separate cults. That's to say, in Mesopotamia, they seem to have assumed, to oversimplify things a little bit, that Enlil and Dagon were two different names for the same deity. In Phoenicia, or at least at the city of Ugarit, they were a little bit more nuanced. They seem to have co-identified El and Dagon in some regard, but they still had separate cults and separate modes of worship for both of those deities. They didn't recognize them as two names for the same god, and yet somehow both of them were both the divine fathers of Baal. It's complicated, but that's sort of an overview of the issue as we find it. And as I mentioned before, although we find evidence of Dagon being worshipped in Phoenicia, the city of Ugarit, and elsewhere, we don't find evidence that he was ever worshipped by the Canaanites. This is rather peculiar, because although Dagon's influence made it all the way east, it doesn't seem to have made it this far west. The reasons for that are probably variable and most likely lost to time, but it is interesting that in the Egyptian Amarna archives and in other Egyptian texts that reference the land of Canaan around this time, as well as in the archaeology of the land of Canaan itself, we don't find the name Dagon, either as a god that people made offerings to or in lists of personal names, many of which incorporated elements from local deities or from external deities imported from afar. We find all sorts of Baal names, all sorts of El names, all sorts of Asherah names. We don't find Dagon names. And that's what makes it all the more interesting to find out that the Philistines were engaged in the worship of Dagon. Again, although the Philistines weren't local to the area, they did live in the land of Canaan. And so they seem to have worshipped Dagon right next to the Canaanites without the Canaanites ever adopting the practice. So there's a great mystery there as to where the Canaanites picked up this central Mesopotamian deity and how they continued the cult of Dagon without the Canaanites ever really picking it up themselves. We're going to put a pin in the discussion at this point because in order to answer the question of how the Philistines found their way into worshiping Dagon while the Canaanites didn't, we have to talk a little bit more about what kind of god Dagon was. Unfortunately, this is a more difficult task than it is with a lot of other ancient deities. Although Dagon was very influential and very important in Ebla, throughout the Mari period and the time after that, we don't have any literary indications of what Dagon exactly did. Likewise, his cult is so fragmentary in the archaeological record that it doesn't give us a whole lot of clues as to what people were praying to Dagon for. So because of that, scholars debate what the most likely functions Dagon carried were. The big three that people bring up are the fact that Dagon may have been a fish deity, he may have been a grain deity, or he may have been a father deity. We'll start with the fish deity option since that ties in with the Lovecraft story we read at the beginning of this. So from very early times, in fact from St. Jerome in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, we see the interpretation of the name Dagon meaning something relating to fish. This is because the Hebrew word for fish is dag. And so Jerome thought that Dagon was the combination of two words, meaning fish of tribulation, so dag meaning fish, on being referenced as tribulation, and that was Jerome's explanation of the name of this deity. This interpretation, although a little bit dubious from the outset, was adopted by several scholars well into the 1800s and early 1900s. And this option was also very popular in the early 1900s when H.P. Lovecraft was writing. So that explains why the monster in Lovecraft's writings is called Dagon. It appears as a fish monster because Lovecraft's understanding of the deity Dagon was that it was a fish deity of the Philistines, as we find in the story. Unfortunately for both St. Jerome and H.P. Lovecraft, which is not a sentence I ever thought I'd find myself saying, it doesn't seem like Dagon was associated with fish. This is something called the etymological fallacy or the root word fallacy. Basically, just because two words have the same root word, or just because two words sound similar, doesn't mean that their functions or meanings are related. The classical example of this is that the word adult sounds like the word adultery, but those two things aren't directly related to one another. So just because two words look alike or sound alike doesn't mean that they're the same word or that one is built off of the other. So it seems like the fish god angle is out, but there's still a couple of options left to consider when we're looking for the identity and the function of Dagon. One option that I forgot to mention earlier was the association of Dagon with storm gods. This is actually a really interesting idea because, as I mentioned earlier, the cult of Dagon moved east to Mesopotamia and west to Phoenicia. In the east, Dagon was identified with Enlil. Enlil is the king deity, but he's also the king of wind and of storms. In the west, he was considered to be the father of Baal, who is a storm deity. So, because Dagon was identified in some relation to storm deities both in the east and in the west, some scholars have extrapolated the fact that Dagon himself must therefore have been a storm deity before he moved to those places, and that after the cult of Dagon moved to Mesopotamia, they identified the storm god Dagon with the storm god Enlil. When it moved west to Phoenicia, they identified the storm god Dagon with the storm god Baal. This is a really interesting option, but I think it's subordinated to another option that we're going to talk about in just a little bit here. Before we get too excited about the storm god connection, it's important to note that some scholars have pointed out that Enlil and El, and therefore possibly Dagon as well, had another function that they all shared, and that is the function of a patriarchal or father deity. In all three of these cases, or at least in the cases of El in the west and Enlil in the east, both of these deities were identified as figures who were responsible for begetting the gods and ruling over them. And if that's the case, then Dagon's identification with both of them may have been less about his role as a storm deity and more about his role as a ruling deity or a fathering deity instead. So the same logic applies. The Mesopotamians took the cult of Dagon and identified Dagon with Enlil because of a function, and the same thing happened in Phoenicia. But it wasn't because they were both storm gods. It's both because they were paternal or patriarchal gods. And this brings us to our final solution for what the function of Dagon may have been. When the fish theory was thrown out in the early 1900s, what came up to replace it was the grain god theory. And the grain god theory has a lot of historical precedent as well. Philo of Byblos, a Phoenician who wrote in the Greek period around the 1st century AD, was the first person to identify Dagon with being a grain deity. On top of Philo of Byblos' identification, we also have the fact that when Dagon appears in several bilingual lists from the ancient world, he's mentioned as being the Semitic parallel to grain gods in other cultures. Specifically, he shows up in several Hurrian bilingual lists, where Dagon is associated with the Hurrian deity Kumarbi, who is a grain god. So not only do we find Dagon identified with Enlil and El, but also with Kumarbi, and in fact the two were co-identified in that Hurrian text. So the possibility that he was a grain god doesn't just lie within ancient reports like those of Philo, but also seem to have been made by connections of the ancient peoples themselves. And this leads us back to our old problem that we've already encountered. Why did the Philistines worship Dagon when the Canaanites did not? What I'm going to present to you here today is the theory offered by Itamar Singer in his book listed here. So Singer's model is one of several, but it seems to be at this point the best researched and the one with the most historical data behind it. That's not to say that it's certain. There are other models out there, and this one doesn't answer all of the questions. But it is a very good model, and I'm excited to share it with you. Singer notes that Dagon would have been a foreign deity for the Philistines that they picked up somewhere along the way. Originally, they were likely from Crete, and when they came to the shores of Canaan, they would have brought their own Cretan religion with them. The Cretes were primarily involved in the worship of the goddess Rhea, who is identified as being an earth goddess and a grain goddess. Singer suggests that at some point after the Philistines made landfall, they encountered the cult of Dagon as a grain deity, and this began a very slow process of identifying their grain goddess Rhea with the grain god Dagon, who was more local to the area. This would have taken place over the period of centuries and would have been a process of cultural assimilation as more and more Philistines felt more and more at home in their Semitic world. To support his claim, Singer looks to the archaeological record of Philistine cities on the shores of Philistine territory in Canaan. Singer notes that in the early period, there is a lot of archaeological record of feminine votive figures. These are small figures used in the cult of Philistine worship, and the majority of them are feminine. But over time, we start to see more and more masculine votive figures appear instead. In fact, at a certain point, they start to overtake and overwhelm the quantity of feminine votive figures in the cult of Philistine worship. So Singer suggests that when the Philistines first arrived on the shores of Canaan, they brought with them their own earth or grain goddess from Crete. This likely would have been the goddess Rhea, known from Greek mythology. But as the Philistines spent more and more time amongst the Semitic culture, they slowly began to synthesize their own beliefs and their own cultures with the cultures of the people surrounding them. And since they brought a grain goddess with them, but the people surrounding them worshipped a grain god, they slowly converted the goddess Rhea into the god Dagon. Or rather, they began to identify what they originally understood to be their grain deity as Rhea with the grain god Dagon. And so slowly but surely, the cult of Dagon replaced the cult of Rhea in Philistine culture. Singer's theory is certainly interesting, and it's definitely the most well thought out theory on the origins of Dagon worship by the Philistines that I've come across. There is one major flaw, or I should say weakness in the theory though, and that's the problem of how the Philistines came to find the figure of Dagon in the first place. Remember, the Canaanites, for all we can tell, don't seem to have worshipped Dagon, and so the question is, where did the Philistines pick up this deity in order to start converting the worship of their own goddess into the worship of this local grain god? Now, it is entirely possible that the Philistines originally landed further north and maybe came into contact with the cult of Dagon elsewhere. We do know for a fact that Dagon was worshipped at Ugarit, and Ugarit was probably destroyed by the Sea Peoples who are related to the Philistines, so it's possible that they picked up the worship of the deity from there, but it nevertheless remains strange that the Philistines are sort of isolated from Dagon worship elsewhere, and yet somehow saw it important enough to make this full conversion of their own cult into a local cult of a deity that wasn't worshipped anywhere near where they wound up. So Singer's theory requires us to believe that the Philistines made landfall further north, maybe in Phoenicia, possibly they progressed further inwards into Syria, before returning to the coast and then making their way down to Philistine territory in Canaan. It's not impossible, but it's something that can't really be confirmed archaeologically. But that being said, it's probably the most filled out theory that's on the market right now, so it's definitely something worth considering. So as a recap, we looked at 4 different possible functions that Dagon could have had. 1, that he was a fish deity, which we've disposed of. 2, that he was a storm deity, which does have some things going for it. 3, that he was a paternal or patriarchal or begetting deity, somehow associated with fertility perhaps. This does also have about as equal amount of strength as the storm god option. And 4th, that he is a grain deity, which had some support in the early period, tended to lose that support, but with Singer's article, it lends more credence to it by giving that theory a model for how it could have worked out. As for me, I honestly have no idea which one is the correct answer. Like I said, unfortunately, textual and archaeological evidence is just too scarce for us to definitively say what the cult of Dagon was involved with. It should be noted, however, that ancient deities could have multiple different roles, and it's possible that Dagon was associated in some way with all of those big 3. It's also noticeable that storms in antiquity were often seen in an agrarian context. You need storms to grow crops, and so the storm god angle and the grain god angle might not be as different as people tend to assume. You could possibly also make a connection with fertility and therefore of the patriarchal portrait, so it's entirely possible that all 3 of the viable portraits of Dagon that we've explored today were true to some extent, though again, we should probably be really careful about what we say about Dagon specifically. By the time that we arrive at the biblical period, the events depicted in the Old Testament of the Bible, the cult of Dagon was already in decline. While the cult would survive to some extent into the Hellenistic period and possibly even into the early Roman period, Dagon would never again see the heights that he saw during the period of the Mari state. Although Dagon once held a high position in the pantheon of many ancient peoples, unfortunately for him, he would never climb to heaven again. So that's it. thank you so much for sticking with me to the end here. This was just kind of a shorter video, something I wanted to knock out real quick and release the same week as the Horned Moses video. I expected it to be a lot shorter than it wound up being, but the further I went down this rabbit hole, the more I realized, oh, there's actually a lot of stuff going on here. I also promised you a short video in the Horned Moses one, and I wanted to follow through on that. So I hope this was really enjoyable for you. Next week, we have some really exciting stuff coming out with the Lost Prophet in the Old Testament, so definitely stay tuned for that. At this point, we're still counting on doing about once weekly uploads, potentially having some smaller bonus episodes like this coming out that aren't quite as long but are still a lot of fun. I'm going to try not to announce them ahead of time because I don't want to set expectations that I can't follow through with. And also, whenever I'm subscribed to a channel I like, I always consider it to be kind of a treat when we get a little bit of bonus content that's released outside the normal schedule. So, if you look at me the same way, maybe this can be a blessing for you too. But again, thanks so much for sticking with me till the end here. I'm still trying to figure out how things are going with the channel, where I want to take it, what I want to do with it, especially alongside the main podcast, which hopefully is out by the time that you guys see this one. I'll have a link to that in the description below if you want to check that out. But yeah, if anybody has any comments or suggestions for future videos, passages they'd like to see explored, or anything weird in the ancient world that you feel like a deep dive on would be justified, please let me know, because there's a lot of fun stuff out there worth looking at, and I want to look at all of it if I get the chance to in this lifetime. So thanks again so much for your time. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all next time.